We're in Galatians, and just to quickly recap where we've been, we have talked about how Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia really breaks the sort of standard letter format that he has in his other letters. It is quite abrasive at places. It is offensive at places. It is much more emotional than a lot of his letters. And we've seen that Paul is not really defending himself in this letter as much as he's defending the gospel. And the gospel specifically that they received from him. And that the gospel for Paul was a revelation from heaven, an apocalyptic event, not something that he made up, but that came from heaven itself. And that Jesus Christ is the content of that gospel, not really its source. The source is God. And the good news of the gospel is Jesus Christ. And as we saw last week, when we looked at Paul's description of what seems to be his description of the Jerusalem Council, which differs a little bit from the way it's described in Acts, the church leaders, in deciding that Gentiles who were becoming part of the way, part of this movement, this Jewish movement, did not have to be circumcised. And that in doing that, they really went against the clear scriptural commandment and historical practice. And that is quite remarkable. And that the reason they seem to do it is that the Holy Spirit and the evidence of the working of the Holy Spirit trumped Scripture. And if you want to see that, if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to go to the YouTube channel and watch that lesson, because I think it is fundamental, and it is something I'm still trying to get my arms around, quite frankly, as to how that works and what that means. The Gentiles, as God's people, must continue to demonstrate righteous living, which is what he talked about with remembering the poor. Was an act of righteous living that was fundamental to Second Temple Judaism. And so acts of righteousness are not required for salvation. They are the marks that you are saved. Okay? And we'll talk more about that in coming weeks. And so today, we're going to look at what follows next in Galatians chapter 2, which is where Paul describes the incident at Antioch with Peter. And before we do that, I've got a couple of thought questions that I want you to think about that may seem a little bit unrelated, but I think as we get into this, you'll see how they might relate to our lesson. The first question is, there are 613 commandments in the Torah. Okay? We talk about the 10 commandments, but that's just scratching the surface of the commandments. There are 613 of them. So my question is, what do you do if in keeping one commandment means that you have to violate another? So, for example, and this is one that gets used quite frequently, imagine that you are in Germany or in the Netherlands or Belgium or somewhere during World War II, and you are hiding Jews in your basement. And the Nazis come to you and they say, "Are you hiding Jews?" Well, is it better to bear false witness and say, "No, I'm not hiding them," or to give them up knowing that they will be killed? You're in a situation where you will violate a commandment no matter what. So, which commandment do you pick?
The lesser.
So what does that imply?
That some commandments are more important than others.
No. Really?
How do you choose?
How do you choose?
Wisdom.
By the
By the rabbi you follow.
Did I hear a comment?
I was just wondering if you said, no, they're not here, and they find us there, are you killed too?
Ah, that's a good question.
Even if you say yes, you're going to be killed too.
Or if you say yes, maybe you'll be killed for harboring them. Okay? Well,
What did Jesus say? The greatest commandment, and then the second is to love God.
okay. So what you get in Second Temple Judaism is you get an ordering of the commandments. And there's generally pretty, I would say, unanimous agreement on what number 1 is. Number 1 is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, or as it says in the Hebrew version, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, from Deuteronomy 6:5. Any idea what number 613 is? It's also in Deuteronomy. And there's general agreement on this one too. And that is from Deuteronomy 22:6. If you come on a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledglings or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. So you can take the eggs or the fledglings, but you can't take the mother. Why? Because if you take the mother,
She can't create it again.
she can't create again, and you kill all of them. Okay, that's number 613.
Is that the reason you can't drink milk?
Oh, that's a different one.
Eat,
That's a different. You can't. Yeah, that's a. Yeah. So there's another commandment that says, you shall not. What is it? You shall not eat a kid, or you should not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And that's that. As we will see, the pesky words in almost all translations are tied up in the prepositions. Okay, because prepositions have different meanings, and the preposition that gets translated in, and the way it's translated today in Judaism is, you can't eat meat and dairy together. Okay, so for example, if you go to McDonald's, you can order your hamburger, but you can't order a McFlurry with it, if assuming the machine's working. Okay, you can't have a cheeseburger. Okay, those are things that you just simply can't do. Ironically, that word could also be translated on, meaning don't eat the baby while it's still nursing. Okay, while it's on its mother's milk. Okay, but that's not how Judaism has translated it. They've translated it to be a dietary restriction on how you mix your meat and your dairy. If you go to a kosher, stay at a kosher hotel in Israel, which on the study trips, if I can ever get to do another one in Israel, we stay at hotels that serve kosher food, and in the morning you will find cheeses and butters and things like that, but not meat. In the evenings, you'll find meat at dinner, but no butter, no cheeses, because you can't eat them together. Okay? Now, here's the funny thing. The other 611 are up for a lot of debate, and there's disagreement. And who mentioned, James, you mentioned Jesus saying, what's the greatest commandment? Personally, I think he's not really being asked what number 1 is. He's being asked what number 2 is. Okay? Everybody agreed on number 1. The question is what's number 2, which is, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? And he does a really interesting rabbinic interpretive technique there that we don't have time to talk about. But I think that's really kind of the subtext there. Other groups would have disagreed on what number 2 was. Okay? For example, the Zealots might have put, you shall have no other gods before me, ahead of thou shalt not kill. Which meant if you see someone engaging in idolatry, you can kill them because that's how the laws are ordered.
So the 613 included the 10?
Yes, 613 includes the 10. Okay? All right, so thought question number 2. Imagine that your heritage or way of life is under threat in some way. What are your possible responses or reactions?
Rebellion.
Say more about that.
To fight against the threat so that it can be restored.
Okay, so how do you fight against it?
Carefully.
Okay, careful. There's a lot of adverbs in that sentence.
It likely depends on what form it's coming in from. Is it militaristic conflict where you have to do self-defense? Is it social where you're having to win arguments, do good PR? Is it...
Let's say it's social. Let's say it's social.
Oh, that's a lot harder.
I saw a hand back here for Amy. Do you have?
Well, yeah, but you've qualified it now.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but my thinking was, okay, a threat to my way of life would be, I get to go to any church I want to, right? Anytime in the week that I want to. But if there's a threat that I can't openly, right, be a Christian, I think my rebellion would be to go underground with it.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
So maybe double down and just become even more rigid in your beliefs.
Double down. Become more rigid in your beliefs. Interesting. Okay. All right. Anybody else?
I was going to say, it depends on how you order the 613. If you believe number 2 is what Jesus said, then you don't do a lot of what Paul did, right?
If you order them differently, what do you do?
Right.
Okay. So I found this interesting quote actually there are several different sources that I use as I'm preparing for this week because they all provide different perspectives. And one of them that I really like is from a gentleman named James Dunn. I believe he was British. He passed away a few years ago. But he says, when group boundaries are perceived to be under threat, a natural response is to castigate those who threaten boundaries as polar opposites in order to strengthen the group's own identity and distinctiveness.
That's not a good idea, though, in practice, because that just tends to make it harder to get people into your group who might want to join your group, and it's equally likely to make as many or more enemies as you are after you allies.
So I'll give you an example from our current affairs.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, imagine that. What do we see happen on both sides, whether it be Republicans or Democrats? How do they position their opponents? As extremists. Okay, a Democrat will say they're fascist, speaking of their opponents, and a Republican will say they're communists, they're Marxists, as an extremist. But in both cases, what they see is a threat or a perceived threat to an identity, a way of life. And so this natural response, and I think we see it all over the place today, and I think social media exacerbates it, is this polarizing of people into different groups based upon the idea or the belief that what is perceived is under threat. Our way of life, our traditions, what we believe is under threat. Iran and Israel is exactly the same sorts of things take place. The same things. So let's think for a minute about the political situation in the first century, in Judea specifically. There's a lot of political instability. The Roman procurators that are in charge of Judea, even starting with Pontius Pilate, are weak. They're not very good leaders. And that causes problems. There's a whole lot of Hellenization within Herod's family and Herod himself. Very little concern for following Jewish law so much as making themselves in good with Rome. There are a lot of Jewish political factions and parties. Okay, we see evidence of this even within the Gospels. And we see a lot of nationalist movements and outbreaks of violence. Okay, if you recall from Acts, Gamaliel stands up before the Sanhedrin and even talks about how there were these different rebels that have come up in the past and amounted to nothing. Okay, we see just after the time that Paul's writing this letter, within probably 15 years or so after he's written this letter, the rebellion in Jerusalem will lead to the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. Another one breaks out in about 128 AD that ultimately really truly destroys Jerusalem and kicks all the Jews out. But you get these movements and these sorts of resistances that keep showing up. And Jewish identity is under threat, not just from without, but also from within. And so how would you expect Jews to respond to these threats to their identity?
Become insular. And then a lot of them just kind of contract. And then they, especially when it comes to people like Christians that are trying to take people out there.
Yeah, but let's remember that Christians are Jews.
Yes,
It's a Jewish movement.
It's a movement that's away from the norm of things that have been there forever. This is a new movement. This could completely destroy the Jewish faith if they allow it to grow.
I think you see a doubling down on what it means to have a Jewish identity. And things like Christianity, which is still a part of Judaism. I almost am hesitant to use the word Christianity to describe it because that means so much to us that it may not have meant to them. This new Jewish movement that says Jesus is the Messiah is a threat. Okay? And so they begin to double down.
Particularly if it's a Messiah, it's not going to create a kingdom because they're expecting the Messiah.
It's a question of what is the Messiah, right? What is the Messiah? And now that this movement is bringing in more and more Gentiles, that raises other questions about Jewish identity. Okay? So, let's talk about the Jews that are living outside of Judea for a minute. They're a minority in the Roman provinces, and they enjoyed special rights granted by Rome. They did not have to sacrifice to the emperor. They got certain tax breaks as part of being Jewish. They were allowed to follow their unique food practices. They were allowed to worship Yahweh according to their customs, and they were generally allowed to observe the Sabbath. And for them, the synagogue became really the central place of worship because you just couldn't get to the temple. It was too far away if you're living in Asia Minor or other parts of the Roman Empire. They had to figure out how to navigate life in a Gentile world. And the way that they decided, the way that they integrated with Gentiles varied by region, and it also probably varied by individual. Okay? There was no one answer. Everyone had a different opinion about how much you engage with Gentiles. And there seem to have been three sort of non-negotiable or generally agreed identity markers for Jews, and that were circumcision, Sabbath observance, and dietary law. Those are the big three. A lot of other stuff was totally up for debate. And even within these areas, there was probably, it would be wrong to say that everybody 100% agreed on these three things. Okay? That's just not the way the world works. But in general, we could say these three things are the big ones. So, with that in mind, let's look at where we were last week. And I'm just going to pick a couple of scriptures for us to look at to set the stage going into this next thing. So it says, "Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up in response to a revelation. Then I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek." Then it goes on a couple verses later, and from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me, God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So, what is the primary issue that they agree on in this Jerusalem meeting? We talked about it last week. What was that major issue?
Well, according to Paul, it was alms for the poor, right?
Well, that's something they agree that they will continue to do.
Right, and then the blood of animals and all that, right?
That's Acts.
Okay.
That's Acts. Let's stick to what Paul says about it.
Okay.
Not being circumcised.
It's circumcision. Circumcision is the issue. The Gentiles have to be circumcised to be part of the people of God. Okay? And they all agree, no, they don't. Remarkable decision. So, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised to be part of the covenant people. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, and I'll mark that with an asterisk. We'll talk about that in a second. Cephas, who is Peter, James and John are the apostle to the Jews. And the reason I have asterisked those is it's not to say that Paul doesn't go to Jews. We know that his practice is to go in the synagogue first. He's certainly not going to refuse any Jews that want to become part of his movement. But his mission is, I'm going to call it the diaspora, out from Judea, taking it to the Gentiles. Whereas Cephas and James and John primarily are focused on getting Jews into understanding that Jesus is the Messiah and what that means.
Even here, you see Peter in Acts working.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So now we get the Antioch incident. And it says, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel Gentiles to live like Jews? Okay? Now, first thing to note is that the way Paul structures this, the way it's written, it seems to indicate that the people he's writing this letter to have heard about this incident from somebody else. Okay? They've heard it from the side of his opposition. And how he's telling the story as he understands it, or as he believes he's telling them it happened. But the question is what is this issue? What is the problem?
The Christians have to follow Jewish people, in the way have to follow the Jewish practices.
Can you be more specific?
Well, certainly, in this case, it was eating with the Gentiles. Probably I don't do it.
Is the issue circumcision here?
It's fear of circumcision faction, but in this case, it's eating with the Gentiles.
And eating their food, right? All based on his white sheep experience.
It's not that, it's meaning the Gentiles are equal in Christ.
I've always thought before this was about dietary laws and whether Jews could have fellowship with Gentiles. And although Peter did, and at one time practiced fellowship with the Gentiles, when Jews came, the extreme Jews, the conservative Jews, that he backed off. But the last sentence you've got on the board says, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? What has that got to do with it?
Okay, that's a very good question. We're going to jump to that in a minute. I'm going to argue, yes?
I think the problem is he was afraid of what people would think.
Peter's afraid of what people would think. Okay. Yeah, and so the question is, I think, what is the issue? I'm going to argue the issue is not circumcision. The issue is the eating is the big issue here. So, first of all, we have no indication of how much time has passed between the Jerusalem meeting and this incident in Antioch. Okay? We don't know. He never tells us how much time has passed, only that, for him, Paul, the way he writes the letter, wants to put them right next to each other so that they're in contrast. Okay? To show the difference between the two. The second thing is, the surface issue here, I think, is table fellowship, meaning eating with one another, and it's the purity implications, not circumcision. But I think there's a deeper issue that's under wraps here, and that underlying issue is authority. And I'll explain why. This is the passage again, where he says, "On the contrary," this is from last week. "On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised," okay, and then 2 verses later, it says, "And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." And then he starts this next section with, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face." Why can Paul confront Cephas in this way? I think it's actually more than him just being equal. What is Antioch? Antioch is Paul's turf. Antioch is the center of the Gentile mission. Okay? So if Paul is going to the Gentiles and they're going to the Jews, then he's in Antioch and Peter comes into his house. Okay, I'm using that euphemistically. And all of a sudden starts behaving badly, and Paul calls him out on it and says, "You are wrong. Okay? You've done something wrong on my turf." I think that's one thing he's saying here. Okay? Did I see a hand go up, Randy?
It seems to me like the term circumcised and uncircumcised is more just kind of a general descriptive, like we might say, he's conservative or he's liberal or he's right or he's left. And
Yes.
Circumcised and uncircumcised is kind of a catch-all to describe Gentiles being, sometimes they call them Gentile sinners because in truth, the Gentiles didn't follow any of their law. So I think the bigger issue, and we even see this with Jesus, the Pharisees in particular, criticized Jesus because he was, eating and talking and hanging out with Gentiles.
Well, with sinners.
Gentile sinners.
But were they Gentile sinners or were they Jewish sinners in Jesus' case?
They were Gentiles.
I think they were Jewish, too.
Well, maybe both.
Yeah.
But my point is, I think when they're agreeing, hey, you're not just ministering to uncircumcised and we to circumcised, it's Gentiles versus Jews, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think circumcised here and uncircumcised are the I had to look this word up this week because it came up with something I was reading for my dissertation. It is a metonym, meaning it's a word that is used as a catch-all phrase for something else. So for example, if I say the word suits, okay? Suits is a slang word that means business people, right? Right? Suits, because of what they wear, okay? Circumcised is a euphemism for Jews. Uncircumcised is a euphemism for Gentiles, right? It's a code word. It's another way of saying it that describes something about them, okay? So you're 100% right about that. So I think when we look at the issue of table fellowship here, which gets to the issue of Jews and Gentiles, what's the problem with table fellowship? Why is it that what Peter and these people from Jerusalem, from James, have done, what is it that's the problem? Chris?
It's a lack of unity with fellow believers. And it's almost as if by separating, they're creating second-class citizens out of Gentiles.
Okay. What's the Jewish problem with this?
They're eating things that are offensive.
Okay, eating things that are unclean. Okay. Did I see another?
It's hypocritical.
Okay, this is a hypocritical practice. Yeah, okay.
So under Judaism, isn't it make you unclean to dine with Gentiles?
Okay, so so this is, I'm gonna try to bust up that myth a little bit. A Jew eating with a Gentile does not make them unclean. Here's what the larger issue is, that it's a little more nuanced than that. So, the Greco-Roman culture is run on patronage. Okay? Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that when you're in a patronage society, where you stand with regard to someone else is very important. Are they better than you? Are they higher up? Are they lower than you? How do you treat someone who's higher up than you versus how do you treat someone below you? Or even on your same level. Okay? And so, one thing that's really important is if you give someone a gift, okay, there's no such thing as a free gift. That gift comes with expectations. If someone higher than you gives you a gift, they expect something in return. They expect your loyalty. They might expect you to do something for them. If you are on equal terms with someone, if you give them a gift, at some point they are obliged to give you something of equal value in return. Okay? Whole society runs on this, and it's the way the Roman Empire actually can function administratively without having an army everywhere. Okay? Patronage. And so, if you invite someone to a meal, there's sort of a cultural expectation that that person will invite you back for a meal, and that if you refuse that reciprocal invitation, it's an insult. Okay? It damages the relationship if you don't properly engage with that individual. So, a Jew inviting a Gentile to their house to eat is not a violation of the Torah in any way, shape, or form. Because the things you're eating, you know, because you prepared them, are ritually clean. They're according to dietary restrictions. But what's going to happen if you do that? They're going to invite you to their house. And you got no clue how that's been prepared. And now you're in a problem. Now you've got a problem. Because if you refuse, you cause a big problem. You break the relationship. So, this was not about Jews eating with Gentiles in Jewish homes. The issue is Jews eating Gentile meals without asking too many questions. And incidentally, Paul, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, actually kind of talks about this, where he basically says, don't ask, don't tell when it comes to food sacrificed to idols. Right? If it's put in front of you, eat it and thank God for it. And don't ask too many questions. Okay? the central concern here is not about Gentile Christians. The central concern here is about Jewish Christians. And how do Jewish Christians have to behave in accordance with the Torah? So the Jerusalem Council deals with Gentiles. The incident in Antioch deals with Jews. And so I want to talk about this phrase, live like a Gentile and live like a Jew. I think there's something going on here. What I think this is to live like a Gentile is probably something that one Jew would say to another, okay, when they disagree with how that person is living. If they disagree with how they've interpreted how they ought to live in a Gentile world. So to live like a Gentile is for them to say, you're not being faithful to our heritage the way I think you ought to be. Okay? So what's happening is a blurring of identity markers between Jews and Gentiles. And it's probably the language that Paul's opponents were using about him. Paul's not living like a Jew. He's living like a Gentile. Okay? He's commanding people to live like Gentiles and not like Jews. He's threatening our heritage. So,
But is it really threatening heritage, or really that it's violating laws, commandments in the Old Testament? So it's not more than just heritage. It's you're disobeying things that are in the Torah.
okay, and here's where we get back to that first question about order of the laws. Which is more important? So my question, though, is, has the Jerusalem church gone back on the agreement they made with Paul? In other words, have Cephas, James, and John changed their minds about Gentiles? Cam?
So I wonder if when the Jerusalem church said that the circumcision wasn't required, that may have been publicly acknowledged and everybody knew that. But then when it came to something like food, maybe they didn't see the connection here. So they might all agree on circumcision, but when it came to these other matters, maybe they thought, well, the Jerusalem church didn't address that, so we're going to enforce our Jewish heritage on these things. And we might they might have missed the big picture here, focusing on just one individual item.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
I mean, we know Peter understood clearly that, based on the dream he had, right? He understands that it is okay to accept Gentiles into the faith. Right? So he is under pressure because his brethren of Jewish heritage still hold that they must not eat things that are unclean. Kind of simple, right? I mean, he understands it.
Yeah. So here's my take on this, and you can feel free to disagree with me. I think the church in Jerusalem didn't change its mind. Circumcision is not required for the Gentiles, and nobody's saying that Gentiles should be circumcised in the Antioch incident. The question in Antioch is what is required of Jewish Christians living in Gentile areas. I think that's the disagreement. And in this matter, Paul disagrees with Cephas, James, and John. I think. And that this disagreement is really a disagreement between Jewish factions about what is required to maintain Jewish identity, what's expected of them. Now, the question is, why does Paul disagree with them on this? Because we see other places Paul seems to adhere to Jewish law. Or at least the way that Acts tells it he does.
Are you interpreting that Peter is thinking the separate but equal clause here?
In a way, separate but equal. So, yeah, so this is the question. Why is it Paul gets so vehemently angry about this? Because he is in this letter. He is angry.
Because he violates the law to love your brothers, right? Peter is not together with the Gentiles. He's drawing back. All of a sudden, it's like, well, I'm not really with you.
Okay. Andy?
Peter is in a real difficult spot because, as Jose said, Peter, he had this vision that said nothing, no food is unclean that God has made clean, right? Yeah. And yet there's the principle that you don't cause a brother who is weaker in faith to stumble by what you are able to do. And so he's got this dilemma. And I think what Paul is seeing, and he even mentions that you're even causing Barnabas to go astray by your hypocrisy. So maybe that's the dilemma right there.
Maybe they already had this conversation.
What's that? Say that
Didn't they
again?
already have this conversation? Isn't that why the don't eat the food sacrifice to idols and blood?
Well, yeah, so it's interesting. The way Luke describes it in Acts is that don't eat food sacrificed to idols, right? There's some other things that Paul doesn't seem to mention in Galatians, right? That, in fact, Paul doesn't even mention that there was a letter sent at all in Galatians, okay? Yeah, so that's one of those questions about Acts and Luke. How do they fit together? I don't think that Paul disagrees because he thinks the Torah is obsolete. I do not think that's what he's thinking. It appears that what has happened, though, and again, this is reading between the lines, it appears that what has happened is that Gentile Christians in Antioch, if they want to have fellowship with their Jewish brothers and sisters, would be compelled to agree to adopt these practices for the sake of unity.
Our history, it's a small thing, but we were identified as non-instrumental in our churches.
Yep.
So we would often tell people to not use instruments if they want to be in fellowship.
Yes,
So
yes.
it's nothing like we
So we're not free from this either. You could pick any Christian group that probably could find a similar thing. They were being compelled to follow for the sake of unity. And I think what would happen as a result is and I hate slippery slope arguments, but in this case I think it's probably accurate, is it's a slippery slope from there to circumcision.
I would say that I would go one step further, because in verse 14 is when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. And to me, this is, and I think it further maybe supported, that they're saying in order for you to be justified, you need to be practicing these things.
Okay.
Paul's like, no. He doesn't want that to be shackled for the justification for salvation. I think they're going a step further.
Okay, yeah, and we're going to be talking more about that in coming weeks, about this justification, right? And where does justification come from, right? But I think what Paul sees is that by forcing Gentiles to comply, if they're going to be able to eat with their Jewish brothers and sisters, which is a big part of the culture, that means they're going to be the ones giving up some of that freedom, okay? That by doing something that will ultimately lead to say, well, why don't you just be circumcised? Just make it easier for everybody. I think it is in a way a very short, slippery slope. And I think that's his big disagreement.
But you some kid that were asking them to be circumcised.
Yes, in effect, it's like asking me to circumcise for the sake of unity, so that we can eat together. It's a huge ask, okay, that Paul says is fundamentally not required, and we all agreed on that, right? Everybody got the memo. We all agreed on that, okay? And that's where I think where he says, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel, there's that compel word again, Gentiles to live like Jews?
Now, what's he referring to? Is it that if you, though as you live like a Gentile? What's he saying?
So I think what he's accusing Peter of is basically saying, look, hey, before these guys came, you were here and you were living like a Gentile, right? Not that Peter was actually truly living like a Gentile, but you were not concerned about the dietary issues of eating with Gentiles. You were, don't ask, don't tell. You were okay with that. And now these people from James comes, and now you're telling all these Gentiles you got to live like Jews, meaning you got to eat kosher. Okay, he's using that as code for you're forcing them to adopt our traditions when you weren't really living according to your traditions when you were here to begin with. Okay. That's the way I interpret how he has positioned this. So now the question is, who wins this debate? We talked about this early in the lesson, but now that we've been into it, and maybe some of you weren't here, who wins the argument?
For that 2,000 years, you said most of the people in the way are Gentiles, not Jews.
Okay, let's go to the micro perspective of the event itself and not the macro. Okay, the micro of this event. Who wins the day?
I mean, if we look at the turf that he's defending, I mean, Paul is calling out Peter's disrespect because he came to Antioch. And so it begs the question, it's like, well, why did Peter go there, or Cephas go there, when he sort of knew what the boundaries were? And so in that present moment, I think Paul won. And I think he further defends that, like when you read his letter to the Romans, because the Jewish Christians are talking about the laws of sin and death. And Paul writes in Romans 8 about the law of the Spirit. And the Spirit is being denied by Peter with Gentile Christians.
At the end of chapter 2, he drops the bomb. Right? That's just settled debate. Paul isn't necessarily Christ-like. I guess isn't that the end all of the debate?
I really feel like this whole argument is not, it's summed up by 3:7-9, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith. This is all about faith rather than action.
Okay, we're jumping a whole lot further. Who is it that wins this argument in Antioch?
I would say Paul does, because in the further writings he talks about being a Jew to the Jews, a Gentile to the Gentiles. So he's taking it even further, saying, be like the people you're with when you're trying to reach them.
Okay. Or maybe nobody wins, right?
So
when the church fights, there are no winners.
So here's the thing. And again, I've always read things exactly what you did. Paul smacked Peter and he won and everything. But here's the thing. If Paul had won, don't you think he would have said, and Peter repented, and they all started doing what they were supposed to do based on what I said?
Of course.
But he
Would
doesn't.
himself on the back.
He doesn't. He leaves it right here. Which, in my mind, tells me that the arguments being made by Cephas and these men from James win the day. Barnabas doesn't repent. Barnabas is led astray. And I think the church at Antioch sides with Peter and the men from James, and Paul is out. And Antioch is no longer the headquarters for the mission of the Gentiles. And I think Paul moves into Corinth. Is where he goes. And then he gets run to Corinth. Things fall apart in Corinth, he's got to go somewhere else. But if he had won the debate, it seems pretty logical that he would have mentioned that when he's writing to the Galatians to defend it. But he doesn't. He leaves it as, this is what I said to Peter to his face. And even Barnabas was led astray.
That's just really sad, isn't it?
It is. And what we see is that this table fellowship is about much more than table fellowship, right? It's about authority over the Gentile mission. It's about expectations for the Jewish Christians in the diaspora. And Paul does not claim that these should abandon the Torah, but he argues that these Jewish identity markers don't override unity in the gospel. Unity is more important than these Jewish identity markers. And that Antioch damages Paul's relationships with the church in Jerusalem, with Antioch, and with Barnabas. And in Acts, we see that when Paul and Barnabas are talking about going on a second missionary trip to all these churches, they have a disagreement. And that disagreement is about who? John Mark, okay? Who abandoned them on the first trip. But who is John Mark's cousin or uncle? I can't remember their relationship. Peter. Peter. So I think Luke's given us a little code about Peter. I think we have two different descriptions of the Antioch incident. Luke's and Paul's. Personally, I trust Paul's in this one more than I trust Luke's. And the Galatian letter is Paul's attempt to mitigate the damage that happened from spreading to these other churches. And that's why he writes this letter. Because he loses that debate in Antioch. Questions?
You're saying that, so then are you saying that there's enough Jewish leadership at Antioch that,
Yes.
that the local church then adopts more of the Jewish practices?
Yes. There were enough Jews in the leadership at Antioch, and the argument was compelling enough that they were making, that they said, no, this is how we're going to go. And Paul says, I don't agree with it. And he goes his own way.
No, I heard it say a while ago that it's sad. It is sad, but it's so realistic. Because all of us that have grown up in the Church of Christ have seen, you would call it a split, you could call it division, right? But just because one person says, hey, you're being hypocritical about the way you're acting and what you're saying and what you're doing, doesn't just change a thing.
Yep.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So I think this story it's a lesson for us to look at and see, but it is a realistic.
And it's also not permanent, right? Paul writes in another letter, about Barnabas, right? It seems to indicate there's some regret there. Paul makes a trip back to Antioch on his way to Jerusalem. He goes back to Jerusalem with an offering from the Gentile churches, which, by the way, he makes a big point about in his letters and Luke hardly mentions at all. Okay? It seems like Paul's trying to mend these damages along the way. Okay? But at this incident in Antioch, it takes a break. Yes, sir.
In Revelation, there's a part where, Jesus really condemns the church for eating food sacrificed to idols. And I'm wondering, you think the, whatever, I guess it's, it's written by John, but was he maybe in the Jerusalem community where there was more strict,
Well, no, it becomes a real issue for the Gentile churches. How much do you engage with the culture? And how do you deal with food sacrifice to idols? And so Paul has to deal with that, right? And he kind of comes up with a don't ask, don't tell policy, right, on it. That really idols don't mean anything, but you got to remember too that you didn't eat meat every day in the ancient world. And sometimes the only way you got meat was at these temple festivals. Okay? So if your family's going to get meat, it might have to come from a temple. So does your family, are they malnourished because they don't get enough meat, or do you get it from this temple? It becomes an issue. There's a whole lot of issues like that in the ancient world that we kind of gloss over around what happens in these sort of border situations where things like medicine are tied up in a temple.
Yeah.
How do you go get healing if it's tied up in a temple? Right? there's a lot of things like that show up. And food sacrifice to idols is a big one that Paul has to deal with. He's not ignoring it, but he's got to deal with it. Okay? We are out of time. So we're going to look at the second half through verse 21 next week. I've asked this several weeks. Where does Paul's speech to Cephas end? Does it really end where we did today, or does it continue on? Ask yourself what happens if it continues on further. What does he mean by justify? What does that word mean? And where does justification come from? And we will talk about those next week. And again, I'd encourage you to read the entire letter. It's not very long. I like to listen to it on Audible. It takes 19 minutes and 35 seconds to hear the whole thing. So anyway, thank you all very much. Appreciate your comments, and we'll see you next week.